All right, guys, we are back in my garage for another video, and I just did the math and I counted that I've done 16 track days in my BMW 340i, which a lot of people find pretty impressive, but honestly, I think these cars are really great out of the box. And I know some of you are probably interested in tracking your cars this year, but I wanted to highlight some of the things that have broken on my car just to give you a little bit of a heads up on what you should pay attention to in case you plan on tracking your car, because everybody wants to go out and get seat time and have fun, but nobody wants to have to trailer their car home or fix issues on track. So in this video, I'll be open and honest and share with you what has failed as well as what's worked perfectly fine to give you a little more confidence before going to your first track day. So hopefully you guys find this video useful. Now, as always, I've got a question for you guys, so I'm curious. Leave a comment down below and let me know what you think is the bare minimum requirement to take your BMW to the track. Keep in mind, this isn't an M car, it's just a regular 3 Series. So what do you think you need to upgrade in order to make sure it makes it through its first track weekend? As always, I'm curious to hear your thoughts. And also just making sure we all have the same expectation here. So I'm talking about things that help you get through a track weekend. These are not things that are necessarily going to make you faster or going to make your car perform better. Obviously, there are a lot of different things in that category, and I'll probably make another video to explain what I think are the best mods to do to your car and what makes the biggest difference on track. Let me know if you want to see that, but this video is strictly about making sure that your car is reliable enough to make it through a track weekend. So let's go ahead and jump into the issues I had. So the very first issue I had at my very first track day was my brake pad wear sensors. And you'll see a really common theme here because pretty much everything is related to heat management. When you're using your brakes a lot on track, it generates a lot of heat. And all of that heat radiates into your wheels, which are just huge giant metal heat sinks basically, and then those are attached to tires that also get extremely hot. So a lot of people really focus on heat in your engine bay and managing that, but all of my issues ended up being more in the suspension and wheel and brake area because of how much heat is generated there. So first up, the brake pad wear sensor, and this was something I absolutely did not expect. I brought my car to the track completely stock and tried tracking it stock before swapping brake pads to see how that would improve performance. And then at the end of the weekend, I swapped back to my stock brake pads and I noticed that my brake pad wear sensors had completely melted. And yes, I say sensors because both front and rear had the same issue. It was actually impressive to see how hot they got to the point that they were bubbling up like that. And it really surprised me that it got that bad because I don't hear about that anywhere. But my fix was relatively simple. I just zip tied them to the shocks. So they're no longer attached to my brake pads. I can do the normal visual inspection that we've been doing for the past 100 years of cars being on the road. I don't really need a sensor to tell me when a brake pad is low, but for this case, you know, it was nice that at least it didn't trigger a brake pad warning on the dash. It was just not really going to work long term. So to avoid any future issues, I just keep it zip tied and mounted onto the shock. And then when I'm done tracking my car, I can replace the sensors with something that I know will work fine for daily driving. Now, at my second track day, I had an additional issue. So while I was on track, everything was going pretty well. And then I got a stabilization error, which popped up. Now, the good news is I was still able to drive the car. It still worked completely fine, but it did lock the car into like the stiffest suspension setting, which I have the adaptive suspension on my car. So it was basically locked in sport. And you might think that that's a good thing. You know, you're on track. Of course, you want to use the sportiest settings. But in my experience, I found that the regular comfort suspension setting actually gave the car the best balance. It allowed me to drive really aggressively. I go over curbs and all of that stuff. You know, if I pay to go to a track day, I'm going to use the entire track. And when you use the stiffest suspension setting, it can make it a little more difficult to manage when it goes over bumps. Instead of just eating the curbs and gripping up and going around turns, sometimes it can skip and really get upset over the bumps and make it harder to make the car do what you want it to do. So it was a little unfortunate. Thankfully, again, I was able to make it through the weekend, but when I got home, I knew it was something that I'd want to address. So I dug into the codes and I saw this acceleration sensor error, which was a little confusing because the car didn't seem to have any issues accelerating, but it ended up actually being a suspension acceleration sensor. So on adaptive suspension, there is this little brick, and that brick measures the speed of the shock going up and down and helps manage the settings for how it's controlling your damping settings. So that's what actually failed on my car. Again, it's right behind the wheel, so I would imagine all of the heat coming from the brakes and the wheels and the tires caused it to overheat. I was really worried that I was going to have to replace the entire shock because obviously those are pretty expensive, but thankfully you can order and replace just the sensor itself. So that's what I did. I bought it from FCP Euro, so thankfully in the future, if it does fail again, I can replace it for free through their lifetime warranty. But I would recommend, if you do have adaptive suspension, just to wrap those sensors in some heat reflective tape, and that will help prevent it from experiencing all the heat that you're going to see on track coming from your wheels and your brakes. So hopefully that should help it last a little bit longer than mine did. The next issue I had was with wheel weights coming off, and I talked about this in one of my previous videos where I mentioned when I upgraded my wheels and got a specific track day set up, I make sure I put reflective tape over the wheel weights. The reason, again, is because if you generate a lot of heat from your brakes, it can actually make the glue or the sticky tape melt and your wheel weights will come off. And that will, of course, make your wheels go out of balance, which can cause some drivability concerns. And so it would be advantageous for you to put some tape on your wheel weights before you go to your first track day. I know it can look a little bit ugly, but it does just give you the added reassurance that your wheel weights won't come off. Of course, you can always remove the tape whenever you need to, like if you're just going back to daily driving during the week. But for the actual track weekend, it'll help ensure that you don't have any issues. There's already enough problems that happen when you pick up the marbles and stuff, and it makes your wheels shake if you go off of the driving line. So you don't want the added issues coming from a wheel being out of balance. So highly recommend just putting some reflective tape on your wheel weights to keep those secure as well. And then the last thing I want to comment on is something that actually doesn't bother me that much, but I know some other people have mentioned it to me, is my brake calipers did change color. Again, I use my brakes in their entirety. I want to make sure I get the most out of the car when I'm on track, so I don't baby it. And what I noticed is the color of the brakes actually turned kind of green. I know some people have said their brakes almost turned purple, but green seems to be the more common color. So maybe there's a little bit of a hue in that BMW M blue paint that they use that allows it to turn green when you brake and use them to their full capacity. So that is something to consider, especially if you've got some fancy powder coating or whatever. Maybe you just want to swap calipers before going on track because the heat will most likely discolor your calipers and you don't want to ruin something that you put a lot of time and effort into. Now, of course, again, in my case, like I said, it doesn't really bother me whether the brakes are blue or green or purple or invisible. It doesn't matter as long as they work well. So functionally, they still are perfectly fine, but that is something to consider if you really value the color of your brakes. Now let's do a bonus round and talk about the things that didn't fail. And the first one I want to comment on is my turbo. So I do have an upgraded Dynamic AutoWorks turbo, and when I brought it on track, I did have an issue with my wastegate. However, that was not caused by the track day. So I've seen some people inaccurately state that, you know, DAW turbos can't last on track, or my turbo broke on track, or anything that is related to that, when in reality, I've been tracking with it for the past 2+ years now with no problem. It ended up being more of a manufacturing issue that Dynamic AutoWorks took care of under their warranty program. And when they gave me back the fixed turbo, I have had no issues since then. So I would say your stock turbo is definitely good enough to handle a track day. I did that for almost 2 years. And then, of course, an upgraded turbo from a reputable company should last as well, whether it's, you know, a hybrid turbo or a full frame. I've seen plenty of people work their cars and push them pretty hard on track without any issues. Another thing I see is a lot of people say they need an upgraded heat exchanger or intake manifold or radiator, and I never had any overheating issues on my car, particularly when it was completely stock. temperatures didn't change barely at all. When I started tuning it, I did switch to using water and water wetter in the intercooler circuit to give me a little bit added reliability and consistency, or you could switch to something like the VP Racing coolant that I run now. Again, that just helps your cooling system run a little more efficiently, but I don't feel like anybody really needs to upgrade anything unless you're in like an extremely hot climate where it's like 90+ degrees on a track day. Then yeah, if you're doing a 20 or 30-minute session, you'll potentially start losing power from IATs getting really high. I think on average, I see my IATs around 40 to 50 degrees above ambient. And so that's just something to consider, because when it gets over 130 or 140 plus, the car does start pulling power. But I never had oil temps getting too high. I never had engine coolant temps getting too high. It was really more about just the car being consistent and having cool IATs so that it was delivering the same performance every time I got into power. So that would be my recommendation. If you're tuning your car or upgrading the turbo, then it's a good idea to switch to water or, VP coolant or some kind of upgraded coolant for your intercooler circuit. But for the engine cooling system, there really should be no risk. So yeah, overall, I would say again, our cars are really capable out of the box. Like I said, I brought my car completely stock to my first track day just to see how it would handle it. I did start doing some upgrades to help improve the performance and consistency, but even a completely stock car can make it through a track day if you manage your braking and your tires and, everything you need to pay attention to anyway. So if you guys are interested in hearing more about actual upgrades and how they transform the car and what I would recommend, let me know. I'll probably do that in a future video, but hopefully this puts your mind at ease that you don't need to completely build your car before your first track day. The most important thing is to get some seat time, feel out the car, then figure out what you want to change before you spend your money. So hopefully this answers any questions you guys might have, and I think that's it for this video. Thank you guys for watching, and I hope this helps. And if you have any other questions or comments, leave them down below.